सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
In this edition of Global Print, I'm going to talk to you about the India-China continuing border conflict, which is in its third year. It started in April 2020, as we all know, just at the onset of COVID. Nobody even knew in India that the Chinese had breached the line of actual control. And subsequently, in June 2020, we saw that the Galwan Valley incidents in which 20 Indian soldiers and at least 4 Chinese soldiers died. But the reason I'm talking to you about the India-China border conflict in this edition, dear viewer, is because of the several diplomatic and political aspects around it. The first is that China's president and general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping, has been invited both to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in July as well as the G20 Summit later this year in September. And the second important aspect is how China and, of course, the other big powers are playing the Russia-Ukraine conflict, which is, in a sense, the defining moment of our times. But before I go any further, dear viewer, I'd like to make an appeal to you. Please do subscribe, pay just a little bit for the Print's free, fair, objective, and unhyphenated journalism. As a subscriber, you get benefits and privileges non-subscribers don't have, obviously, but it also helps us to do the kind of journalism that the Print has been known to do these past several years, which is free, fair, objective, and unhyphenated. Now, in my column, Global Print, this week, I talk about the India-China border conflict. And like I said in my introduction, it is the third anniversary. A lot has changed in these last 3 years. The Chinese have gone back to their side of the line of actual control, but status quo ante has not been restored so far, despite 17 rounds of border talks. And one of the manifestations of that is that in the Depsang plains, the Chinese troops are refusing to let Indian troops occasionally patrol their side. So prior to 2020, Indian troops did not occupy those plains, nor did the Chinese troops, because, as you know, it's a disputed boundary. In fact, maps also have not been exchanged in that area. But with forewarning, both Indians and Chinese did allow the other side to come and patrol these areas. Now, since 2020, that has not been allowed by the Chinese troops. So in a sense, you can argue, that, if you want to argue, dear viewer, that the Indians have ceded ground. But that's not the whole picture. So the first is that there is still a lot of talk, a lot of work to be done on the border. The standoff isn't over yet, but it seems as if the Chinese are in no mood to agree to what the Indian position is, which is the status quo ante. And this is going to be interesting because in the coming months, Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, and the general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, which is a very, very powerful position, he's really top dog in many ways. He is going to be in India. Well, at least he's been invited. We don't know if he's going to come or not, but he will be here, or he has been invited to 2 big summits. The first is the SCO, or the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit, for which he has been invited, which will take place in Delhi in July. The second is in September, which is the G20 Summit. Now, the second one is really quite interesting because all the leaders of the world's 20 largest economies, led by the US, the European Union, China, Russia as well, they're all coming, or we all hope they're coming. And I think it will take all of Delhi's diplomatic finesse, not to just to bring them to Delhi, but to sit around the same table. Imagine that, dear viewer. Vladimir Putin, the president of the Russian Federation, Joe Biden, the president of the US, both of them right now in a proxy war over Ukraine. Ukraine is in a terrible spot these days over the last 15 months or so, but it doesn't seem as if that conflict is getting over anytime soon. And clearly, the US fighting its proxy war via the Ukrainians in Ukraine, the Russians not willing to give up so far, throwing everything that they have into a battle. So this ego battle is also definitely going to show up at the G20 summit if both show up. Xi Jinping, the third big leader, the third big power, the Russians and the Chinese, as you know, supporting each other. Although Xi Jinping has not openly come out in support of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So it will be quite interesting. Imagine if you were a fly on the wall during the G20 as well as the SCO summits, dear viewer, but we hope to bring you the kind of news that we always have had these past several years. Another reason to subscribe to The Print. But one of the first things that has struck me, which is what has allowed me to talk about the India-China border conflict this week, has been Home Minister Amit Shah's visit to Arunachal Pradesh. Now, as you know, in the days preceding Amit Shah's visit, the Chinese renamed, within quotes, because this is a unilateral thing that they did, they renamed 11 cities in Arunachal. They call it Changan, which is the name that they have given it for some reason. And they renamed these 11 cities, in reaction to which Amit Shah went to Arunachal. The Chinese protested, the Indians have rejected that protest. So there has been an escalation of rhetoric between India and China on Arunachal. Now, to just give you some more context, in December there was a face-off between Indian and Chinese troops in Tawang, which is the contested or the disputed region. And the reason for that is because the 6th Dalai Lama, some years ago, some 1 or 2 centuries ago, was born in what is Tawang today. And that is what the Chinese call South Tibet. Now, the Dalai Lama, the current Dalai Lama, the 14th Dalai Lama, who lives in India in Dharamshala, it was via Tawang that he arrived in India in 1959. As you know, he fled his home in Lhasa at the Potala Palace at Burgulinka, where he lived, and he made his way via the wastes, the southern wastes of South Tibet, and came into India at Tawang in Arunachal Pradesh. And so the Chinese always consider Tawang in many ways to be the heart of the problem, because in 1962 they returned this whole area, 90,000 square kilometers, to India, kept Aksai Chin on the western front. Today they are putting pressure on India, both in Ladakh and in fact at several places all along the 4,000 kilometer long border from Tibet in the north to Arunachal in the south. So the question that a lot of people are asking now is, if the border dispute escalates or if it's not resolved by the time the SCO summit and the G20 summit comes up, will Xi Jinping even come to India? And I think that's dependent on two things. The first is that while we've seen this rhetoric, this Amit Shah going to Arunachal, which he had to do because there was no way that India could not respond to the Chinese escalatory tactics of renaming those Arunachali cities. So Amit Shah had to go in a sense. But where is this escalation going to stop? Is there some point of no return, for example? And does that mean that when you reach that tipping point, Xi Jinping, whatever you may do, will not come to India for the SCO as well as the G20 summits? One more thing I'd like to add here, dear viewer, which is that the Modi government has been building incredible infrastructure right along the LAC. In fact, General Satish Dua, who is the former army commander of the 15th Corps based in Srinagar, told me this, that the Modi government is building a road right along the LAC, so up and down the mountainside, just parallel to the LAC. And we've seen that how the building of border infrastructure in Ladakh basically triggered the conflict from the Chinese side, and then they allegedly crossed the line of actual control and came into Indian territory. Now, there is an important international dimension to the India-China border standoff, which is now, of course, 3 years old, and that is the role that the Americans have played. Now, in the last 3 years, India has become much more involved in the Quad nation grouping. It refuses to call it a military alliance. India doesn't like it to have a security dimension, which is clearly something that the Americans are somewhat unhappy with, and they're pushing it to make it much more of a security grouping. We've seen how the Americans have come out openly and said that the Quad is really to contain China, but India in many ways wants to have nothing to do with it, which is a good thing, because remember that India is the one which is the neighboring country to China, and even if the Americans have problems with China's global rise and their economic power threatening the US, India must maintain some sort of a middle position on this whole sort of diplomatic situation, even though it's very clear that India needs the US as an ally to hedge itself against the Chinese. But in my view, there is an even more important aspect of this India-China conflict, and that is the economic relationship between the two countries. Now, we have heard over the last several months, in fact, over the last 3 years, that India will have nothing to do with China, that the relationship is going to be curtailed as much as possible. We've seen how India has banned several hundred Chinese apps. Chinese technology like Huawei's 5G technology has not been allowed to participate in the tendering process in India. But what is interesting is that India-China trade, for example, has gone up year on year. And let me just give you some statistics. And I'll just give you a couple of figures over the last year. Trade in 2022 has broken all previous records, touching $135.98 billion. China's exports to India climbed to $118.5 billion, a year-on-year increase of 21.7%, while India's exports to China were only $17.48 billion, a year-on-year decline of 37.9%. And we also know that Indian traders have been selling raw material to China and very happy about it because they're making money hand over fist. But what does this signify? What does the increasing trade in China's favor signify on the India-China border conflict? It's impossible to compartmentalize these things, dear viewer, because on the one side you have the political dimensions, which I've explained to you about. Then you have the global dimension vis-a-vis Russia, the US, and other big powers. And now you have the economic dimension, clearly in which the Chinese are streets ahead. And what is disturbing is that the trade is increasingly in favor of China. So that, in a sense, undermines the fact that India may be winning this war, or the Americans, by supporting India, by backing India, are actually helping India, at least help India win the battle of perceptions. But what is very clear, and the data shows this too, is that China is winning the economy war, where if the trade is so clearly in China's favor, then nothing else seems to matter. So this is the weakness that I would like to point out in this edition of Global Print, the weakness of the Modi government to not be able to assert itself on the trade question. The fact that India is coming off COVID, its economy is not as strong as it should have been. The Russia-Ukraine conflict has exacerbated the story globally. But the Modi government needs to do much more so as to be able to improve both manufacturing and the services sectors. It's only then that India will be able to put teeth into this battle that is fighting with China. And once it does that, once the balance on the trade front is restored somewhat, and it's not as huge as it is today, then it will be very clear that India will be fighting back, not with its back towards the wall, but will be fighting a just fight. And that's when the border standoff between India and China will have much more resonance, if you like. So I hope you will read my column Global Print on the Print's website, and I do look forward to your suggestions on this video. Thank you so much for watching.